computer.
Excuse me, sir. We've begun.
Oh, hey, shout out my YouTube channel.
All right, so our lecture topic for today will be a little bit of review. We're talking about due process of law. And so the outline is sort of broken into 4 parts. We're going to start off by laying out what is due process and where does it come from. The second section is what are some of our due process rights. The third is about limits to due process in 2 particular areas where there are some limits. And then the last section is about criticisms. Hey, welcome. Hey, come on across. Say hi to YouTube.
Hey, YouTube.
The outline is posted on Portals if you would download that. And we're recording it, so we'll post this one and you can get whatever you miss from the video. Okay, so we're starting off with what is due process? Where does it come from? Okay. We want to make sure we understand the definition of due process. So due process is the idea that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures. I'll say that again because that's a lot there. Due process is the idea that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures. Due process places restrictions on the government in order to protect your individual rights. So the government has to follow certain procedures. It doesn't say you can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property, right? Because the government can throw you in prison. That's taking away your liberty. The government can execute people. That's taking away their life, right? The government can take away your property. It's just that they can't arbitrarily do it, right? They can't just toss people in jail just because, right? They have to follow procedures. And so our ideas of due process here in America, we really get those ideas in 2 different places. The first is the Magna Carta. And Miss Lotta was all excited because she was like, they're going to remember the Magna Carta. You guys remember the Magna Carta?
Yeah, they made a rap about it.
Good. She's going to be so excited. She was like, there was a song. Great. She'll nerd out. Okay, so the Magna Carta is a really important document in British history that limited the power of the king. And establish that basically the king can't just throw people in prison that he doesn't like. He's got to follow certain rules. That's kind of an oversimplification, but we don't have to be experts on the Magna Carta here. I just want you guys to get the idea that, oh, we borrowed this idea from Great Britain. And it's not like Great Britain was the first one to come up with it either, right? It's just that was part of our heritage as British colonists. We like that idea that we don't want the king to just be all powerful and throw people in prison just because he doesn't like them. There has to be certain laws that are followed if you're going to throw someone in prison. Right? I'll read you the actual words. You don't need to write this down. But the words in the Magna Carta say, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. So there has to be a trial, or there has to be certain legal procedures that you follow. All right, and so then the second area where we see due process as it applies to the U.S. is, of course, the U.S. Constitution. Right? Due process shows up in two places. It shows up in the Fifth Amendment, which says the national government has to protect your due process rights. And it shows up in the 14th Amendment and says the states do as well. So the Fifth Amendment applies due process to the national government. The 14th Amendment applies it to state governments. All right, so let's move on to our second main topic here. Okay, we've got an idea of what due process is. The government has to, if they're going to throw you in jail, they got to follow certain rules. They can't just be like, Emma keeps talking and we don't like what she's saying, so in jail you go, right? Some countries in the world that can happen, right? You speak out against the government, you find yourself in jail, right? But here in America, you have to follow certain rules. So the second part is about, well, what are those due process rights? What are some of these important due process rights? And I put in your outline there just the idea of protecting suspects throughout the criminal justice system. And so I've broken it up into sort of four parts here. When someone is being arrested, and then before, during, and after a trial, there are due process rights that you have. Bless you. I think. All right, so during an arrest, suspects must be informed of their rights. And so we talked just a minute ago, you guys said, oh yeah, cop shows, right? We know about that part. So that would include the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Police have to tell people what their rights are when they're being arrested. So when the police officer arrests the bad guy in Law and Order, they start reading off that list, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law, blah, 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 blah. What is that called?
Miranda?
It's called your Miranda. That's reading the Miranda warning, okay? So this actually, the reason it's called a Miranda warning is this comes out of a case called Miranda v. Arizona. Terrible Z. The reason police officers do this is because of a real-life case called Miranda v. Arizona. Where basically this guy Miranda was arrested and he was interrogated without being told of what his rights were, and he confessed to the crime. But then he actually sued and said, well, wait a minute, I didn't have a lawyer with me. Nobody told me I didn't have to talk. I didn't know that I didn't have to do that. I didn't know what my rights were. That wasn't fair. And so the Supreme Court agreed with him, right? The outcome was that police officers have to issue a Miranda warning, right? And anything that is said before that is inadmissible in court. Meaning they can't use it against you. So the police have to tell you what your rights are if you're arrested for a crime. Somebody asked one year, they were like, so does that mean like, right when they're arresting you, before they read you the Miranda warning, you could be like, I did it! And then, oh, can't use it! Like, I don't know. All right, so even when someone is being arrested, they have to be informed of their rights. So once someone's arrested, right, they're going to go into the criminal justice system. They're going to have their day in court. So before a trial, there are a couple things a couple due process rights that you're kind of protected against here. One, again, this could go with before trial, or it's not really, it could be during arrest, but it could fit maybe in more than one spot. But one thing you're protected against, we already know of, is you're protected against unreasonable search and seizure. Unreasonable search and seizure. Right, so you're suspected of a crime, and the police have to follow certain rules in order to like search your stuff, right? To go search your house. And more often than not, that means they have to have a warrant. But as we have learned, you don't always have to have a warrant. Before the trial, you also have to be informed of the charges against you. And I don't really care that you necessarily know the Latin terms, but this is a concept called habeas corpus. Right? That you can't just throw someone in jail and not tell them what they're being charged with. You have to be told of the charges against you. And that term habeas corpus will come up a little bit later in the lecture because we're going to talk about a time when the government actually shut that down and suspended it. All right, during a trial, right, while the trial's going on, suspects have due process rights. Right? First off, you have the right to a speedy and public trial. Right, the Sixth and Seventh, you don't have to. The Sixth and Seventh Amendments grant that right. Okay, you have the right to a speedy and public trial. Speedy is, some people would say it's, the courts are not particularly speedy, right? But it's the idea that, again, Emma speaks out against the government. We charge her with a crime. We can't lock her up for years and years and years without giving her a trial, right? And a public trial. They can't do this behind closed doors. Okay, this has to be out in a public setting, in a courtroom. Okay. Another important, while you're on trial, a suspect's on trial, they are protected against self-incrimination. And this is out of the Fifth Amendment. You are protected against self-incrimination. What that means is you do not have to testify against yourself. If you are suspected of a crime, you do not have to testify. You can. They can't stop you, but they can't make you either. So think about the Gideon movie that we watched, right? One of the things that really showed he didn't do this crime was when they went back and did the retrial, his lawyer put him on the stand and was able to ask him questions and show he didn't do this, right? But sometimes lawyers might say, no, we don't want you to take the stand because we can make a really good case to show you're innocent. But if you get on the stand, the other lawyer gets a chance to ask you questions too. And we're worried that you might say something or he might trip you up and it might make you actually look guilty. So you don't have to take the stand. You're protected against self-incrimination. And this is what you see on those crime shows, pleading the fifth. That's what pleading the fifth means. Students have asked in the past, well, why wouldn't you, if you didn't do the crime, why wouldn't you? And there's a great video on YouTube, and it was actually, the professor was, I think at, what's the one in Virginia Beach? No. Yeah. Drawing a blank. The Christian school in Virginia Beach.
Oh, Regent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Regent. I think it was a professor there. And he did like with his classroom, he basically like laid out a few facts of a case and then kind of kept going for a little while. And he came back and he asked a question. And almost everyone in the class raised their hand saying, well, this is what happened. And then he scrolled back to what he had originally said, and it wasn't what happened. It was just the way that they had remembered. And so his point was, look, a lawyer could easily trip you up. Memory's kind of fickle. And so you could end up saying, well, this happened, and that's not what happened, and now you look guilty like you're hiding something, right? And so, you can see why sometimes people might say, no, I don't want to take the stand. Okay? All right, after a trial happens, there are due process rights to protect you. Okay? One, if you're found innocent, you are protected against double jeopardy. Which is, of course, when the point values are doubled and there are two daily doubles. Alex Trebek shows up, ridicules you in a very polite way. It's my favorite when somebody answers something and he's like, ooh, no. Double jeopardy is referring to the fact that once you are found innocent, you cannot be put on trial again for the same crime.
So like, even if you do the crime again?
No,
like
that's a different crime.
Okay.
You're like, we're going to accuse you of stealing a car. Put you on trial. Jury found you innocent, said you didn't do it. You go out and steal another car. That's a different crime, right? It doesn't give you immunity to just, I didn't steal that car, so now I can just steal any car, right? They can't turn around. The idea is they can't turn around and say, a jury found you innocent. We're just going to arrest you again and put you on trial with a different jury, right? The government can't just keep putting you on trial until you're found guilty.
What if they reopen the case because they find more evidence later? Like, so you're found innocent.
Tough luck. Should have found that evidence before.
Really?
Right?
Wow.
Okay? You were put on trial. You were found innocent in a court of law. Right? You are protected against double jeopardy, which is why prosecutors have to make sure and investigators have to make sure that they've really done their homework before they go to trial. Right? And why sometimes it takes a while to investigate a case and make an arrest because they really want to make sure they have an ironclad case. Because you don't just get to arrest the person again and put them back on trial just because you don't like what the jury said. Right? There's actually a movie. It's going to drive me nuts. I can't think of the name of the movie, but it's got Richard Gere and I can't think of the name of the movie. Richard Gere plays an attorney, and he's defending this guy who is accused of a murder, and he's basically got like some mental issues going on, and he's very like soft-spoken, quiet, like scared of everything. But then when he gets like really triggered, he like becomes another person, and he's explosive and violent. And so he's able to show that's what happened. That this guy had so he didn't deserve the death penalty. And so basically they found him innocent of the crime that he was accused of because of this. And then he finds out at the end the dude had been playing, right? That actually the violent, explosive, that's who this person is. And he was playing as, right? But he had been found innocent of the crime, right? Okay, so that's if you're found innocent, right? If you are found guilty, okay, you still have some due process rights. For example, you have access to the parole system. And you are also protected against cruel and unusual punishment. All right, so part 3, let's talk about some limits to these rights. And there's 2 main areas I want to go over where those rights can be limited. And one you're probably aware of because we've talked a little bit about this in school settings, is juveniles, right? People who are under the age of 18, minors. Juveniles do not have the exact same due process rights as adults. So going back to the early 1900s, if you remember, there was the whole progressive movement where you had reformers who were trying to make improvements to society. One of the ways that they made some reforms was they separated minors out from adults in the criminal justice system. They said, okay, if people are under the age of 18, if they're minors, they should have sort of a different justice system than adults. And we're talking about minors, M-I-N-O-R-S, not E-R-S. That would be a person who digs in the ground. So minors do have a lot of the same due process rights as adults, but minors are usually tried in juvenile courts. So they go through sort of a different court system, special court system just for people who are underage, who are accused of a crime. And in the juvenile system, you usually face less severe penalties if you are convicted. For example, you might get sent to like a reform school or a juvenile detention center rather than an adult jail. The court has also ruled that juveniles cannot face the death penalty. Minors do not necessarily have the right to a trial by jury. And the court has also said that students, right, in the school setting, students do have some limits on their due process rights. And so if you think about in the New Jersey v. TLO case that we studied, right? That was about search and seizure. Okay? School authorities don't necessarily have to follow all the same rules that the police would in a school setting. Okay? But it is important to note that that doesn't mean juveniles have no rights. Okay? But it's just limited. All right, the second area I want to talk about in terms of limits is during periods of war. Wartime limits on due process. The Constitution actually allows Congress to suspend habeas corpus during periods of war. Congress can suspend habeas corpus during periods of war. And this would allow the government basically to lock people up, without having to go through all of the legal processes, right? They don't have to, they can lock them up and kind of keep them locked up. And it's pretty rare, but it has happened. Perhaps the best example was during the Civil War, right? Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War in order to lock up Confederate sympathizers who were in like Washington, D.C. and Maryland. Now notice I said, who has the authority to actually suspend habeas corpus?
Congress.
Congress. Is Lincoln Congress?
No.
No. He did it. He just took that action. And later on, the Supreme Court came back and said, no, you can't do that. And Lincoln pretty much was like, I don't really care. I'm doing it anyway. Right? Because this is a national emergency, and we're going to have to keep the nation safe. Right? So again, it doesn't happen much, but it has happened. And, you know, if you think about in sort of this period of time that we're in, sort of the post 9/11 world, there have been a lot of questions about legal rights during periods of war, right? You know, the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. If we arrest a terrorism suspect and keep them locked up in Guantanamo Bay, do they get these same rights? Right? It's kind of a tough question, right? And there aren't really clear set answers. Right? This is the job of the Supreme Court to kind of weigh in on those issues. All right, last section here, and then we're done. Criticism and controversy. And really sort of kind of point out two sides of the argument here over due process. Okay, there's sort of two sides to the coin here. Some people argue that all of these due process rights make it hard for police officers to effectively do their job. Their argument is that there are so many rules in place that it's too easy for someone to get away with a crime on a technicality. I don't think anyone's going to argue that we shouldn't have any due process rights, okay? But some people do say, you know, some of these maybe go a little bit overboard. They make it hard for police to do their jobs. Oh, this person did this crime, but the police waited too long to read them their Miranda warning, so now they get away with it, right? But on the other side of the argument, you have some people who argue that our due process rights don't go far enough. Or that they aren't enforced as well as they should be. And they will point to the issue of, you know, sending an innocent person to jail because their due process rights weren't followed. And they'll say that's never okay, right? We have to follow these very closely because we never want to send an innocent person to jail, like Gideon. Right? Gideon spent 2 years in jail for a crime he didn't do. And they'll point to that and say, if we had more closely followed, if we had actually protected due process rights, that wouldn't have happened. Right?
When that happens and they find out that they were innocent, like, do they have to pay them because they were in jail?
Yeah. I mean, you could potentially sue, right? I don't think it's like automatic, but there's probably some sort of compensation down the road. All right.